they like you. Assalamu alaikum, ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's brilliant to see so many of you here this afternoon. Welcome to the 12th Emirates Airline Festival of Literature, and in particular to this event, which is about adventure and perseverance and pushing yourself right to the very edge of what you think you can achieve. My name's Julia Wheeler, and I'm delighted to welcome two authors who are giants in their field, and their field is a world of extremes. Sir Chris Bonington began climbing at the age of 16, tackling Mount Snowdon in Wales in hobnail boots from his local army surplus store, while his climbing partner made do with only his school shoes. That was 1951, and since then, Chris has spent a lifetime among the world's highest and wildest mountains, taking on the north face of the Eiger, the south face of Annapurna, and the highest of the high, Everest. Sir Ranulph Fiennes was the first person to reach both the North and South Poles by surface travel, and the first to cross the Antarctic continent unsupported. He's led over 30 expeditions, including the first polar circumnavigation of the Earth, and through those, he's raised over $23 million for charity. In 2009, he became the first old-age pensioner to reach the summit of Everest. They are his words, not mine. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chris and Ram. We have to say that this is not the first time you've met, and it's also, when you have met before, it's the first time that you met, it wasn't in one of these extreme situations out in the wilds in danger. It was on television, Chris, wasn't it?
Well, no, it was a media incident. And there was a wonderful competition called the Krypton Factor, which played out on British television for many, many years. And it was essentially a challenge that was meant to be both physical, so you had a race round an army assault course, but also mental and also intellectual. So you had a series of intellectual and mental kind of challenges too. Well, I was invited, and in fact the four adventurers were going to be myself, Ran, Robin Knox-Johnson, the famous sailor who was the first man to sail around the world single-handed, and a balloonist. So I thought, well, this is fine. Ran will win the assault course. He's 15 years younger than me, super fit, SAS and everything else. But then I'll come and easy second. And so we set off. And Robin Knox-Johnson, I didn't even think, sailors, they're not fit, they can't do things. And he went out like a bolt. And I couldn't keep up with him. And that damaged my ego, something terrible. But anyway, so I came in third. And then there came the intellectual bit. And I'm very glad to say I won that hands down, even though I also had failed all my A-levels.
Really?
Both of us have got a lot of things in common. Both of us had, I think, uncomfortable school careers.
Well, that's one thing. It's been wonderful to read your two books at the same time as sort of companion pieces, because I was able to draw out some of those similarities and the differences. You talk about failure. Ran, how important do you think it is actually to fail fairly early on and then go on and be a winner?
Well, I've managed to be successfully, constantly failure. But I think that learning things earlier are better because you then put them right sort of earlier on. And so the earlier, the better. And many things have happened with both of us. What you didn't mention, Chris didn't mention, was that we were both tank soldiers. Chris was in the 2 RTR, Royal Tank Regiment. I was in the Royal Scots Greys. And we were both positioned, whatever you call it, garrisoned in a German town called Fallingbostel, Effing, yeah. And I can remember they were probably his tank regiment, certainly my tank regiment, the Scots, considered themselves the best Russian tank killers on the range with model Russian tanks. And we were looking forward to the Soviets attacking so that we could show the world that we were the best at killing them. And of course, they never did attack. But what one had to do then was our soldiers got so bored that they started beating each other up in the NAFI. And our job was to stop them doing that by keeping them doing what was called adventure training, which was paid for by the taxpayer, doing what we wanted to do but paid for. And so we did that, and some dreadful things sort of happened. I mean, tiny things, for instance, you had to, because your Scottish soldiers were stopping all over Germany at night after doing 100 miles a day in canoes or whatever, the Weser, the Rhine, the Rhone, and so on, they were in villages. And so the Ministry of Defence decreed that we, the officers who were taking them, had to take a certain amount of condoms with you to hand out at night to anyone who wanted them. But none of them ever did want them. So I ended up, after 5 years out there, with 3,000 condoms. So when I got home, I wasn't sort of married at that time, to Mum. I thought, well, she never goes into the attic, so I'd put them all up there. And that was fine until 5 years later, when the tanks went wrong in the attic in the cottage, and the plumber went up there and found that mice had destroyed all these 3,000 condoms, and they were all over the place. And I had to explain to my mother. Sorry, I think I might have gone off the point there.
Do you think? Let's steer it back on. I mean, let's talk. I mean, you didn't love being either in the RAF, which was your first choice, or the army. Talk to us about how you made that transition into adventuring and making a profession out of that.
Well, I think I discovered climbing as we started. We tried to climb Snowdon completely ill-equipped, and the end of that story was that an avalanche came down, and the two of us were swept down about 500-600 feet, and we survived it and pulled ourselves out of the bottom. We were very lucky because we weren't swept over any crevasses, and then shook ourselves and got back to the road and the youth hostel where we were staying. And Anton, he hitchhiked the next day back to London, never ever to go into the mountains again. And I was absolutely, totally hooked. It was fantastic. And I then, in the youth hostel, there were some people who were rock climbers, and they were talking about it. And I didn't even know that the activity of rock climbing existed, but I knew that I had to have a go at it. Found a friend of the family who'd done a bit, and he took me climbing. So that's how it all started. And then I never thought I could make a living as a climber. So I was due to go to university. I was quite bright, in fact. And I had a place in University College London. And there was a series of disasters. I failed in one subject, which was English, which was meant to be my strongest subject. And I was so appalled by that. And then you had to go back and take all three subjects again. I couldn't face that, so I left and I went into the Air Force to do my national service. And I chose the Air Force because I wanted to go into mountain rescue. And they then, because I'd been to a private school, public school in English, they automatically put me into the officer's stream. And then I always like pleasing people. So I actually, when they asked you, well, don't you want to fly? And I thought, oh, yes, of course, I have a passionate desire to fly. And I instinctively knew I couldn't. I mean, my mum had never owned a car. I'd never driven anything. But I said, yes, I'd love to. I was amazed to get through all the tests and things. Found myself at the Royal Air Force College, Cranwell. You had 2 hellish terms, and then you became an officer cadet and started flying. I was hopeless. But I decided I liked the services, so I went into the army. But everything, so it was a journey of various failures, and yet they led to me actually finding the things I love doing.
But all of these expeditions and adventures and things, they need finance, don't they? Talk to us a little bit about how your planning and your raising of finance and how you got people on board for the Transglobal.
Well, you're quite right. The first rule of thumb, and luckily my late wife was as good as me at it, was never pay anybody for anything at any time. So don't have a bank account or checkbook which might tempt you to break that rule. And we ended up getting 1,900 sponsors for that expedition, and it took us 7 years of work unpaid doing that sort of thing. But the answer in detail is you've got to use the English language in a clever way. Basically, for instance, I can remember on one day in the City of London, with Anton Bowering, we had to do two things. One is to get an entire free insurance cover from Lloyd's of London for the entire expedition, the ship and everything, all free of charge. We had to do that, and there was a meeting of the Lloyd's, 12 of them, to decide whether or not. And on the same day, because the American owners of the Observer newspaper were coming over, Atlantic Richfield, we had to persuade them to give lots of money to have the Observer as our PR outlet, yeah? So we went first of all to the insurance people, and I can remember what we did was to explain that this expedition was the safest, most unrisky, better planned expedition had ever taken place. And that afternoon, we had to persuade the Americans that this was such an exciting, badly risky expedition that the Observer newspaper would cover it. And by clever use of the English language without actually lying, you could make both appear to be true.
How helpful was it to have Prince Charles on your side?
Have a which?
How helpful was it to have Prince Charles on your side?
Oh, no, we wouldn't involve him in that sort of thing. But it was helpful in many vital, much more important things, like when the expedition was going, after we'd done the Antarctic crossing, the first ever crossing complete of Antarctica, came out the other end, and the ship met us and all the rest of it. And then suddenly, our third member out of the three of us, who'd been together 6 years planning it and all that, and he was threatened with divorce. So he left us, and there was only two of us, Charlie, the South African, and me, on the land group, yeah? And the committee of Sir Vivian Fuchs and all the famous people on our committee back in London, including that officer that had thrown me out of the SAS, all that lot decided...
It's all in the book.
Well, they decided that it wouldn't be safe for them. They were the ones who'd get the thing if people were killed or anything. You must have 3, not 2, on a thing like that. And so they said, we will send out an SAS officer, one of the best SAS officers, to be with you. Well, Charlie and I, by then, had been in the office and on the expedition for 8 years together. We didn't want a third person, even if it was risky. So we couldn't go against that high-grade committee and the Foreign Office. So I rang up from God knows where we were, out of Antarctica, New Zealand, probably. I rang up, where does he live? Begins with H, Highgrove, yeah? And got on to Prince Charles, and I said, you are patron and all the rest of it. Could you please pull your what's-its over the committee of high-up polar people and tell them that you feel the people out in the field are the ones who should know, and that he, Prince Charles, would help take the can if one of us did get killed and we weren't replaced by someone else. So Prince Charles was excellent, but not in telling lies.
You talk a little bit about risk there, and about team members. Chris, let's talk about how you choose the team that you're going to go up the Eiger with, or up Annapurna, or up Everest. Who do you want on your team?
Well, for me, I mean, where I think Ran and I are very different, and what actually impresses me incredibly is that you've done all these incredible enterprises, and getting a group of volunteers to do it for absolutely nothing. And that is incredibly impressive.
That was Ginny's expertise.
And, well, it was amazing. And we've always gone, I suppose, in a conventional way that climbing expeditions always had done. And I'd evolved, I suppose, from, a passion for rock climbing and slowly developed and went to the Alps and served a very long apprenticeship of learning how to climb in the Alps, getting to the Himalayas, learning the Himalayas and everything else. And working through that, and the people I chose to go on expeditions with me were people who were also already climbers, and most of them were, in fact, people I knew very well. Most of them were close friends, so that one invited people on that kind of level, and certainly there's sometimes, they had faults and everything else, and one accepted that. And one also, one worked out a budget for the southwest face of Everest, which is the biggest expedition that Britain's ever sent out. And the whole expedition cost about £800,000, which was about $1,000.
And that was what, 1975?
Or $100,000. Right. That was in 1975. And we knew we needed one main sponsor. And there we went actually with Barclays Bank, and both I and our agent, George Greenfield, knew people on the board of Barclays Bank. And so we persuaded them to do it. And they did, they backed us. And then for them, they had a hard time because they had a press conference to announce it. And the then chairman of Barclays Bank was a very shy man. And he was expecting to lead this press conference, be praised and everything. And the very first question he was asked was, how can you possibly, at a time of financial crisis, and it was a financial crisis at the time, people were being refused their overdrafts, can you possibly justify loaning money or giving money to an expedition that almost certainly will fail? And he was wonderful because he kept his calm, and they backed us to the hilt. And also at the end of it, we actually, because we were successful, and the expedition made a profit, and then all the profit of that expedition went, in fact, back. We gave it back to Barclays. They were very good as sponsors because they gave a lot to a thing called the Mount Everest Foundation, which had been founded to actually finance expeditions. So, the whole thing worked in the end.
So you've worked with these mountaineers before and they've become friends. But Ran, in your book, you say actually you don't want to take friends necessarily on expeditions.
I usually end up hating the other person. And the worst big polar expeditions I've been on have been solo because there's nobody to hate. And you want to. I don't like to sound in any way unpleasant, but that is it. Yeah.
I really get the impression, actually, that there's a process there, and that once you've done it once, twice, you know that, first of all, you hate the weather and the conditions, and then you hate the person that you're with, and that's actually what gets you through.
Certainly, the hating does definitely help, and in the Arctic, not the Antarctic, but the Arctic, where you've got all the falling in and all that, and getting very, very cold and wet and so on. And the bloke who took over, Dr. Michael Stroud from Southampton, is into science and the body starvation and all that sort of thing. And I can remember the first time we set out from Russia to the North Pole was particularly difficult, and the water was behaving very, very badly amongst the ice. And so it became very difficult. And if he happened to have diarrhea that particular day rather than me have diarrhea, then I would be going well ahead of him. And he wouldn't like it, because sometimes there'd be ice and there are no tracks left, and he's frightened of getting lost and missing, and I had the tent. And that sort of thing. And then it could be the other way around, sort of thing. And so we were planning another expedition after that in a pub in London, and drinking, a friendly mode, no reason for hate in that circumstance. And he said, by the way, Ran, last year in the Soviet Union, ice up Siberia, off the coast, I hated you to so much extent. Oh, I should just interrupt by saying that polar bears up there, of which there were many in the area where we were, will only go and attack the rear person. Even if there are 9 people, they'll go for the 9th person. So as leader, I naturally choose to go first, which means that Mike is last, which means, unfortunately, that he carries the pistol. And in the pub, he was saying he hated me so much, he was actually planning where to shoot me. He decided that he would shoot me where there was some open water, in case Scotland Yard or something came out. And I thought that was quite funny in the pub, until 2 years later we were back there out again with him and the pistol behind me.
Chris,
could I just ask a question? But surely but you and Mike, you've done so much together. Surely you've developed a friendship.
Not on the ice, no.
No, not on the ice. Well, I can imagine that. Yeah, well, the same thing actually with him with expeditions. Yeah, one has arguments on expeditions, and then they either that's the end of a relationship, or in actual fact, once you get back and it's all over, and you forget that, and you carry on and plan the next one, and so you have become friends in that circumstance.
Yes, that's quite right. But it's been very competitional. And the age range, Mike is 11 years younger, but he's definitely stronger. And although he's small, he's called Mighty Mouse sort of thing. And on the expeditions, all the food, which as you know behaves how you're going to behave, is planned by him. And very often you're really, really hungry as you get in the tent, and it's a very small tent for 2 people, and he's doling out the rations which he plans. In a very scientific way. So every time I think, to tell him how lousy this stuff is, he comes out with all this scientific, you can't argue with him, that's the trouble. And there was one part of the daily rations for 120 days, which was actually tasty. It was called a flapjack, and it was homemade, so different sizes. And I noticed after quite quickly, that the one he doled out to me was always smaller than the one. And my wife had a Labrador and a Jack Russell, and when she feeds them, the Labrador gets a dirty great bowl and the Jack Russell gets a little one. And Mike is much smaller than me, so I should be getting more. But it didn't work, sort of thing. And I thought I mustn't say to Mike, look, you're being unfair with the flapjacks, because it might start bad vibes, But I thought it, and it got worse and worse. And after about day 80, I said, Mike, look, do you mind if every other day I get to choose which flapjack I have? And he said, yes, no problem. So actually, I could have asked him a long time earlier. And I have to say that you get nasty with hunger. And it wasn't more than about 2 weeks after he agreed on that. And you don't eat your flapjack or your chocolate until the other bloke has. Otherwise, you've eaten it, and you have to sit in the tent listening to him chewing his last chocolate. So it's the last thing you do together, and you watch the other bloke, to make sure he doesn't get ahead or behind. And at that stage, even though I had chosen it, my flapjack started looking smaller. Yes, your head. You get nasty.
Yeah. Are people nicer up mountains?
I think not really. No. I think mountains are different in the sense that you're focused on actually getting the mountain climbed, and there's a level of excitement in it. And I think actually, I actually enjoy. I love climbing, and even on epic expeditions. Most of the time on an expedition, you have a lot of free time. And I do a lot of reading. So in those days, it was paperbacks, and everyone bought 4 or 5 paperbacks. I love playing cards. And a pack of cards, if you like bridge, is a wonderful time. And in my later expeditions, I must confess, I invited people along more because they would play bridge than whether they were good at cards. And so that, that your expeditions were from that point of view much more relaxed. And yet also there is, I lost all too many people on expeditions I led. And that you didn't, people would think when they came into your base camp, what a callous lot we were, because we'd still be laughing and talking and everything else. And yet, yes, one's feeling of loss is considerable, but you accepted it because it's part of the game you play. And you've got to keep going as it is. And most of the time, I'd make the decision, but I remember on one expedition to K2, we lost someone, Nick Escort, my closest friend, very early on. And at that point, I felt I had to have a fair democratic vote between the 9 expedition members. And the 2 of us, and I was one, thought we should go on, and the others voted to come back. And I was almost relieved that they had, and it was the right decision. And so we went back, in fact, to tell the widows of these 2 guys of what had happened, which is the right thing to do. But you've got to play each thing as it comes, basically.
I mean, there's glory in this, there's determination, there's perseverance and all of those things. But it also strikes me that for those people who are back at home, and you both had long marriages, who both wives were very supportive of what you did, but it was also a bit selfish. I mean, in your case, Wendy was back at home holding the fort, and there was one occasion, I think, where she lit a candle waiting for you to come back, because she was so worried about you. So just talk to us a little bit about how you balance that within your partnership.
I mean, the problem with any adventurer, be it polar, like Ran, or myself as a mountaineer, there is a passion in what you're doing. And that passion is so strong and so powerful that you know it's selfish, but you couldn't give up. And at least, I think, one's partners, and Wendy and Jenny Rands, knew what they were doing and what they got in for, and loved them for what they were. And it's more difficult with the children, my 2 sons, and I know, and you've learned later, just how much they did go through. But in a way, they once again, they hadn't got the right to ask me to stop doing it, basically. So it was, yes. I think we climbers, yes, we are selfish, there's no doubt about it. But I think it's incredibly important that you have in any society a group of people who want to take things to the absolute limit. And if you lose that sense of adventure, and I think there's a danger in our present society, there's an awful lot of safety first kind of mentality that's developed. And I think that kills a society. I think a society needs that adventurous spirit. I don't know what you think. And so you've got to go for it. And you accept the fact you are being selfish, but you try to make up for it.
So Ginny was very much a part of your expeditions, wasn't she? Particularly on the science side.
Yeah, she was a nerve centre and the person who thought of them in the first place. Yes, that's exactly right. Which is very lucky, one is lucky who you marry, sort of thing. And that was just amazing. I would advise anyone taking up this sort of thing. But then when I got born, I didn't have a father. So now, to answer the question you just asked, Chris, I don't feel sort of guilty leaving my daughter, she's now 13 anyway, with her wonderful mum, because she's a very good mum, and I feel that I was brought up with no dad, and I had a wonderful mum, therefore I don't feel guilty when I go away on expeditions.
So there is this glory and there's the adventure for adventure's sake. But talk to us a little bit about the science, because that's actually been important in terms of the sponsorship and getting backing, hasn't it? That symbiosis, if you like, between the adventure and the scientific discovery.
Yeah, the charity and the science are the side effects which aren't to do with the actual expedition. And I have to say that the charity one is very important, obviously, and one can be selfish, When I'd had a heart attack, I went for British Heart Association, And when I had cancer, I went for Marie Curie cancer. So there's a sort of selfish element. And then a good friend had MS, so we raised 4 million to start opening the first British MS research centre at the Addenbrooke's in Cambridge. And yeah, so the charity thing is very important. Scientifically, I got very upset when the Canadian version of The Economist, called Maclean's, said in their profile, they had a monthly profile of somebody, they did one on me, and they said, and Rand finds his expeditions have no scientific value. So we got on to a High Court libel lawyer in London and produced one of our scientific reports of 560 pages from one expedition, including when Ginny had got the Polar Medal, the first woman to do so, just through the science into ionospherics. And we had a 3-day court with a 12 jury, and they had to pay us £100,000 and an apology for saying that. The science was very important. And when we got, you know, Anne Robinson?
On BBC TV.
Yeah, she had a sort of frown always. Yeah.
She's the weakest link one, isn't she?
That's the one,
Yes.
that's the one, exactly. Well, she ended up saying the same sort of thing, so we squashed her too.
I don't know where to go with that one, really. I'm just glad she's not behind you with the shotgun. Let's talk about Everest. You've both topped Everest. Chris, you talk to us a little bit about the planning and the first time that you were in charge of the expedition, and then when you actually reached the top, you yourself as Chris Bonington.
Well, the whole expedition thing, we've done our little bit for science, but nothing like as much as you. But I've nearly always had, our doctor usually has got a scientific program that he does do. And I think as far as putting money back, raising actually the funds to actually go on the expedition has filled the horizon. And we've got a certain amount of money from a thing called the Mount Everest Foundation, but which was founded, in fact, from the 1953 Everest expedition. And all the profits from that went into founding the Mount Everest Foundation, which basically supports mountaineering and mountaineering scientific expeditions. And so that's a way of helping the sport that we live in. But as far as we're concerned, I'm lost.
We're halfway up Everest.
Yeah.
So you've arranged that 1975 expedition,
So
but it was later
yes,
when you actually
the
got
big
to the
expeditions, yes. Well, then I've loved basically doing pioneering and going to places where people haven't been before. And so I've been to the Himalayas about, 19 times now. And every single time, those 19 times, we've always attempted an unclimbed peak. And we've failed on some and succeeded on others. So it's really, that's the prime drive to do that. And Everest Southwest Face almost became, it was the challenge of that time. In the 1970s, Everest, of course, was a hugely attractive mountain in the sense that there were only 3 major routes up it, up the ridges, and the faces hadn't been climbed at all. And the southwest face of Everest, which is gives the highest altitude climbing anywhere in the world, was the great challenge, and a whole series of expeditions that attempted it. And I really wanted to have a go at it, because I realized the problem on Everest was a logistic one, primarily, of actually planning your expedition, getting your supplies on the mountain and everything else. And I've always been interested in planning. I'm a great military history buff. And so that I'd worked that out how we could actually do it. So it was really that kind of planning that intrigued me. And there's no doubt about it. It was a complex business to do it. And then on all my subsequent expeditions, you plan them as well as you possibly can, and then you go and try to do it.
And after all that planning, how did it feel to be right up there?
I finally got to the top of Everest in 1985, and I'd been twice to attempt the southwest face, and in 75 we succeeded. But your chance as leader of the expedition of going to the top is remote, because if you're with a large expedition, your role as an expedition leader is to make it happen. And if your ambition is to get yourself to the top of the mountain, you're not going to be doing your job properly. I always gave myself a chance of getting to the top, or a second or a third summit go, and every time something happened, so one had to actually rush down and get things sorted. So I still hadn't climbed it. And in 82, we had a very small expedition. There were just 4 of us attempting a new route on the northeast ridge of Everest. And interesting, actually, going a slight diversion, then talking to Rangs, in that 1982, weren't you stuck in a wintering
floating ice floe.
in a floating ice floe?
Yeah.
So there they were completely. They didn't even know that the Falkland Islands War had started. They had no communications at all. I actually had a little shortwave radio, and I've always been passionately interested in military history and current affairs. So I had my little shortwave radio going all the way, and it was a very small expedition. There were only 4 of us. Trying to climb a new route on the northeast ridge of Everest, listening every single day to what was happening on what was happening in the Falklands, all this. So while you were there, I was at 8,000 meters, listening to the latest news on the Falkland Islands War.
And you were completely cut off.
Let's
talk about your Everest adventure.
Before you do,
yes.
Anne Robinson, she said that Charles Burton and Ran Fiennes, during the Falklands War, and they're both in the territorial SAS, have managed to get themselves onto an ice floe and thereby to evade the Falklands War.
You don't like her.
No. But basically, climbing, Chris's expeditions go up and ours go flat, and I made the mistake every now and again of looking into Chris's world. And the first time I saw on television, which was horrific, it's a thing that sticks out of the sea in Scotland.
The Old Man of Hoy.
The Old Man of Hoy, and it is horrific. And watch Chris going up this solid thing when the waves down below bashing against the rocks and so on and so forth. And eventually, through bad management, we found ourselves having to do the same thing behind a bloke called Steve Venables.
Steve Venables, yeah.
Yeah, he was a proper climber like Chris. And he said, when you get to the top, that's okay, but the dangerous bit is on the way down, because the way we come down abseiling is past a load of, what are those birds that are sick called?
Oh, those are fulmars.
A load of fulmars, and they don't like you because of their nesting circumstances, but we have to go down that way. So say nice fulmar, good fulmar, as you go by, or they will be sick on you and the smell will stay forever.
And they are anyway.
Sorry?
They sick on you whatever you tell them to.
Well, Venables said that there was a chance. Anyway, I got past the first load of them by talking nicely and going very slowly sort of down. And the next lot, for some reason, we're in a bad mood, and I got it all over.
Ugh.
But luckily I had a helmet on, so I thought that's fine, it won't smell and my wife won't get upset. Got down to the bottom again and got across back to the mainland, where my daughter and then baby were. And I said, don't worry, I won't smell. And she said, but you've got holes in your helmet. They have holy helmets. And of course it stunk. Yeah. So anything where I tried to copy Chris has come to doom.
And we should just say that you climbed the Old Man of Hoy when you were 80.
Well, I made the first ascent to the Old Man of Hoy in 1966, when I was at the height of my powers, drifted up it. And then a great friend of mine, Leo Holding, persuaded me to have a go to celebrate reaching the ripe young age of 80. And I had a great idea, and I did. And I was very, very unfit at the time. My late wife, Wendy, had suffered from motor neuron disease, and I've been caring for her. But it was a kind of catharsis to get out and do it. But I pulled 2 discs right at the bottom, and I climbed through the agony and got to the top. But I've been paying for it ever since.
And your climb of Everest was also in the wake of your first wife's death, and you've also talked about that being a way of getting through the grief.
I thought that for a whole year I'd just been so miserable and done nothing at all. I'd get myself out of it by trying to fight the vertigo thing, which I'd always had. Even at school, climbing buildings, it was at night, so you couldn't see down. In the SAS, jumping out of aeroplanes, you're not meant to close your eyes because you might go into someone else. I always closed them. But I thought I'll get myself out of it by, vertigo, you think Everest. Well, I did anyway. And I'd been asked by Sibu Sisto, the first black man from South Africa, like me basically, to get up there, who had wanted to go up the other side, the Tibetan side, because then he'd be the first black man from both sides. So he asked me because his sponsor in Cape Town was called Harmony, so they wanted black and white South African harmony on Everest sort of thing. So I said, sorry, Sibu, but I get vertigo. But the next year, when I was wanting to do it, I got back onto Sibu, and he said, yeah, there's still time. So what you do, those of you who've been up Everest, you will know that what you do is you go
Should we just have a show of hands? Who's been up Everest?
Well, you go to a base camp, and then they take you up and down, up and down, up and down. It's called acclimatization. And after 2 months, in the end of May, yes?
Yes.
You basically are there. And on the last night, 28,500 feet, 300 meters from the summit ridge on the Tibetan side, I had like a heart attack. And it was in the dark, because with that bloke Ian Parnell. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, Ian Parnell, a good friend of mine, yeah.
Oh, right. Well, him and a Sherpa who was a Lama, and we got up there about midnight on a steep bit on that side, Tibet, and I suddenly had this heart attack. I had by then got glycerine trinitrate in case of a big angina warning, but you've got 16 pockets, and I couldn't remember which one they were in. You're holding on with mitts onto this thing, and you've got a cylinder and a mask on thing, and I desperately tried to get the glycerine, because it felt like the stitches, when they'd done at my bypass, were being pulled apart. So I desperately wanted the pills. And eventually, I was panicking by the time I found them, and I took them. And to cut a long story short, Ian and the Sherpas got me back in 3 days to the base camp. And the doctor down there said, can I see your pills? I said, here's the bottle. And he said, no, the pills. And I said, well, I obviously took the pills. And he said, yeah, but there were 80 in here, and you're allowed a maximum of 2. It's a sort of Guinness Book of Records, really. And so we failed, and Marie Curie raised over 2 million through a failure. So they thought they were keen I should do it again, even if I failed. But I refused to do it on that side. They said the other side was easier. So Nepal, yeah. And so we went back in 2008. And that time we passed at a place called the Buttress. Does that ring a bell?
But was this on the final day?
Yeah, 5 hours from top.
Well, you go, yeah, well, the hard bit is the Hillary step.
Oh, no, it was before
that.
Yeah, just before that. And we passed 3 bodies, my Sherpa father and Rob Milne, the Scots climber, both of whom had bodies which they'd been covered by snow, but that year there hadn't been much snow, so that they could see their bodies. And then, by this buttress, we came to a top Swiss climber who'd got to the top with no oxygen, a good climber, and got hypoxia, whatever that is, and they were burying him, and I wimped out. But the next year, because Marie Curie realized I was an old age pensioner by then, and they'd make 4 million from the nice public, even if I didn't get that sort of thing. And that time I had a new Sherpa who was brilliant. He didn't say it's a tourist. He looked at you, worked out why you failed, and he put it right. And we got up, no problem at all. But the trouble was we got up there in the dark, and the BBC, who'd been filming it for 2 months down below, desperately couldn't use all their film footage without us getting on the top. So when we got to the top, and his camera, which the Beeb had given him and explained how to use it, the Sherpa Tundu, he said, camera, not enough light, because there's moonlight on the top of the clouds, isn't there, down below?
Yeah, that's right.
And yes, so we had, he said, we shake hands, we go down. Their reputation depends on their tourists not being...
Not losing too many.
Yeah. And so he didn't want to linger up there, but I was much more frightened of getting back to the BBC with no proof of film. Well, you would be, you know. And so I said, I'm really sorry, Tundu, we must wait until dawn when there's enough light. So we sat there for about 2 hours on the top, sort of, which was cold, and eventually the sun came up, and I said, Tundu, now, yeah. And he was delighted, and he said, camera frozen.
Oh, no!
But there was a guy called Kenton Cool, who came up with his clients a bit later, and he said, Ram, what's your problem? And I said, film, it won't work. And he said, well, I got a camera, I'll take stills. That'll help, that'll keep the BBC happy, because at least it's sort of proof you're up there. And so we grinned at the camera with frozen grins and got down okay, but on virtually no oxygen, because it had dwindled by that time. And I have to say, when I got down the first time with the heart attack, the doctors in Bristol were trying to work out, because I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I was fairly fit back then, but one of them said, but he got it on EasyJet. I was flying on EasyJet, and they agreed that must be it. Angelini.
You need to stick with Emirates.
Yeah.
You need to stick with Emirates.
Right.
Let's get the microphones out. There's a microphone here, one here and one here. Pop your hand up if you've got a question and we will get a microphone to you. There's a question in the middle here. Keep your hand high. And we've got someone over here that we can come to afterwards. Pop your hand up there and then we'll get one. Yes, go ahead.
Hi there. I'd like to ask if there's ever been a time on your expeditions where either you or members of your team have basically lost their bottle, and if it's happened, how have you been able to deal with it?
Lost your bottle, did you say?
Yeah, lost your bottle, lost your nerve.
Lost your courage,
people
yeah.
have got panicky, etc.
Yeah. Has there been a situation like that?
I think, well, as far as I'm concerned, in leading an expedition, and especially a siege-style expedition where you have quite a lot of people, but if anyone ever wants to go down and feels that it's too dangerous, I would never argue with him whatsoever. I'd accept it. And if we're a very small group, it means if one person goes down, you all go down. And I accept that as well. So that it is an individual's choice, and you accept it. And if you're in a team and one person needs to go down, I accept that, and we go down. And I'd never argue about it. On an expedition, you build up that with a number of people, and that sometimes does happen, that someone does want to go down. Well, that's fair enough. You accept it just as it is.
Ran?
Yeah, well, after trying to do Everest to lose my vertigo, the boss bloke, Kenton Cool, Chris knows about him, said, Ran, I presume by now we've got you to lose your vertigo, because you got up there eventually. And I said, well, no, because I'd been back home since then, and there'd been a whole load of leaves and like more in the gutter, and I'd put the ladder up and it had started quivering, and it came back. So I had to send my wife up, and I held the ladder. That was after Everest, so I hadn't lost it. So I said to Kenton, to be honest, no. He said, look, I will make sure, I promise you I will get you to lose it. There's a place much cheaper and easier to get to than Everest, which would do, called the Eiger
North Wall of the Eiger.
Yeah, North Face. And he said, I will teach you to lose your thing on that. And so he did a whole lot of training on other minor places right near Mont Blanc. And eventually the day came to do it. And he put this Ian Parnell man behind and him up front, sort of thing. And while they were there, it sort of gave me confidence. And the two rules, which are fairly simple, is one, don't ever look down. And the other one is don't allow yourself to think down, even if you're not looking, sort of thing. And with them, but as soon as I couldn't see them, it sort of came back. And every now and again, there's a sort of bird tweeting somewhere below your feet, and the bells from Grindelwald, way down, 5,000 feet or something below. And so it was touch or go. But we got to a place called the Traverse of the...
Traverse of the Gods.
Traverse. That's right,
Yes.
Traverse of the Gods. And he said, when you're going across, make sure you look at your boots, because you can fit them into little holes on the pokey things to go front.
Yeah, that's right, little holes. Yeah.
Right.
You can walk, but it's a very, very dodgy walk.
Dodgy walk, even Chris says that. And, but as long as I could see the lead one going ahead with the rope, but then it went round like that. So he disappeared round there. And the bloke from behind was holding onto the rope, and I couldn't see him. And I was out there, and you couldn't not look down, because you had to look down to see a thing. And below your boots was what?
A void of about 5,000 feet.
Yeah, so, which is vertiginous stuff.
Yeah.
And not like Everest at all, no. So basically, I lost my cool, or bottle, as the gentleman said, and started screaming at both of them, and particularly the one behind, to get me back from this horrible position where I couldn't see Kenton. And Kenton, I didn't know, he was round the side trying to fix a thing in, because he knew that I was liable, if to fall, I would fall off, I'd pull them both off. And I didn't know that he was delicately doing that. And I screamed something, I can't remember what it was, and I got a load of invective back. I couldn't see him, but it came back. And we really fell out in a very big way, but we didn't fall off, luckily. Yeah, bottle lost.
I'm intrigued that what makes, for me, climbing, is a complete self-indulgence, because I just love the whole process of climbing. But you, as far as I can see, pretty well hate it.
Yeah.
So what gets you to do it?
No, after I go, I promised never to do another one. I did that easy thing called Vinson.
Mount Vinson. Did you go to the top of Mount Vinson?
Yeah.
I made the second ascent and the first British ascent of it.
Good heavens. And then there was a guy called Roger Meyer.
Yeah, I remember Roger, yeah.
Yeah, I remember. No, that one was enjoyable, the Antarctic one. And it was on a very warm day and good weather, yeah. But I still don't like it. But on that one, as Chris will know, there's no drops. That's the key thing.
It's a good walk, basically,
Yeah.
isn't it?
No. And people say Kilimanjaro. Lots and lots of people have done Kilimanjaro. But when you get to the top, you walk along the top there to get to a stick. And then you go back, and all the people who've come up by different routes meet at a sort of little tea place in Boulders. And our Marseille guide took the four of us back down there. And there were lots of other Marseille guides with other groups. And they were all talking. And one lot said, last night we leave dead South African on top. And a third group got up, and the guide came over and said, why do you say that? He said, well, why not? He said, because I lose dead African on top, South African on top last night. And it transpired that both of them had died, and both of them had taken only 2 days to get up there. So that, if those of you who want to go up Kilimanjaro, it's 6 days.
I say 6 days, because I've done it twice. I took my family up the first time, and I took the company that I work with, and I took all of them up. But I said to both of them, we must take 6 days.
Right. So there were 2 dead South Africans on Kili.
Yeah, because they tried to rush it. But that's the fatal thing, both, well, on that, or even on Everest, where once again, because I was the last expedition in 1985 when I got to the top of Everest. And it was the last year that the Nepalese government only allowed one expedition on the mountain at a time. And it was wonderful. So we were a Norwegian expedition. They were good. You don't like Norwegians very much,
I don't.
do you? Well, these were lovely. They really were. And anyway, so with my Norwegians, and there was no one else there. And it meant that we had, when we were at the South Col, the route up from the South Col was absolutely virgin. And there was myself, two of the Norwegians, and two of our Sherpas. And the Sherpas, we took them up with us so that they could share the experience. And we were all climbing on equal footing. And we soloed the whole climb. We didn't put a rope on because we didn't need it.
When I say I don't like Norwegians, it basically, we had a problem in 1972 when it was a race between who could get further towards the pole from land without support. And Ginny was in a radio somewhere else, and she was reporting what she read in the Norwegian newspapers. Now, the bloke that I was doing it with was called Charlie Burton, and Charlie was a crude bloke, not just because he was South African, he was just pretty crude. And he couldn't, and the newspaper said, and Ginny came through in Morse code into our tent, yesterday, the Brits, Fiennes and Burton, broke the existing world record towards the pole, but our boys under Ragnar are catching them up, which unfortunately was true. Now Ragnar, his second name was Forthketh. Charlie couldn't pronounce that, and he said, can't pronounce that, we'll call him Foreskin. And this somehow leaked out to the Norwegian press. And their big newspaper, which I'm sure you know, is called the Bergens Tidende, and she read out Morse code that it then said, and the Brits have taken a prostitute on their sledge. This was just getting back, typically sort of getting back. And there was a newspaper in those days here called The News of the World, and it elaborated the Norwegian story about the prostitute.
Okay, shall we not do that? I think that's
How do you
really
have an
good
answer to
place
the
to end it. We haven't. It's been absolutely fantastic listening to you reminisce and enjoy it.
All I was going to say, Julie, is we lost two of our main British sponsors because of the prostitute story, which is totally untrue.
So I'm thinking we don't want to lose any of ours.
No. we didn't even take toothpaste because it's not vital to survival and it weighs something. So
yes,
prostitute,
fair enough.
Christ.
Fair enough. Chris and Ran are going to be book signing. If you've got questions and want to have a private chat, do go to the book signing. Let me please.
Oh, that's great.
I'll keep off prostitute.
That's brilliant.
Absolutely wonderful. I would also please like to thank the room team, the AV people, the wonderful volunteers. Thank you to you for coming. Thank you to Emirates Airline, our title sponsor, Dubai Duty Free, Dubai Tourism, Dubai Airports, Dubai Culture, and the Emirates Literature Foundation. But most of all, thank you so much, Ram and Chris.